Louis XVIII was a monarch whose overwhelming obesity turned even the simplest private actions into scenes of humiliation. His massive body became stuck on the royal toilet so often that servants had to haul him out by force, while the narrow chamber filled with the sour heat of old urine, stale sweat, and the sharp, fish-like odor rising from his unwashed skin. His immense size made it impossible for him to care for himself, and he regularly urinated into his clothes during audiences, while the suffocating stench that followed him everywhere made courtiers grow pale and faint in his presence. Louis XVIII took the throne of France in 1814 after Napoleon's defeat, and he arrived at power already carrying the physical burden that would define his reign and ultimately destroy any dignity his position might have commanded. He was 59 years old when he became king, and decades of exile living in various European courts had been spent eating and drinking without restraint, consuming meal after meal of rich foods that his body could not properly process. This was not the normal indulgence of wealthy people in that era. This was something excessive even by the standards of French aristocracy, where multi-course feasts were common but usually balanced with at least some physical activity. Louis ate constantly throughout the day, starting with a breakfast that would have satisfied 3 normal men and continuing through lunch and dinner and late-night snacks that kept servants busy in the kitchens at all hours. He particularly loved fatty meats swimming in heavy sauces, game birds stuffed with butter and organ meats, rich pastries filled with cream, and wine in quantities that would have made a seasoned drinker pause. His stomach, already damaged by years of this abuse, could not handle the volume or the richness of what he consumed, leading to constant digestive problems that manifested in the most embarrassing ways possible. During state dinners and formal banquets, Louis would release foul-smelling gas with such frequency and force that people seated near him would visibly recoil, and the smell would spread through the dining room, making everyone acutely aware of the king's failing digestive system. He seemed either unaware of or unbothered by these emissions, continuing to eat and drink while courtiers tried to maintain their composure and pretend they had not just been subjected to the smell of partially digested food fermenting in the royal intestines. The sounds were often as bad as the smells, loud wet noises that echoed in the formal dining halls and made it impossible for anyone to pretend they had not noticed what was happening. Servants standing behind his chair would exchange horrified glances as another round of gas escaped from the king, and the nobles seated at his table would suddenly find their own appetites diminished despite the expensive food in front of them. Some courtiers learned to position themselves as far from the king as protocol allowed during meals, claiming they needed to attend to some urgent matter whenever they were assigned seats too close to where he would be sitting. The immediate result of this constant overeating was obesity that progressed from merely heavy to genuinely monstrous over the course of his reign. By the early 1820s he was estimated to weigh somewhere around 300 pounds, an enormous size for a man who was not particularly tall, and the weight distributed itself in ways that made movement increasingly difficult and eventually nearly impossible. His legs swelled with fluid retention and gout, the joints inflaming and becoming so painful that even the pressure of bedsheets against his feet would make him cry out. His torso expanded until his chest and belly formed one continuous mass that made bending forward impossible, and his arms grew so thick that reaching across his own body to perform basic tasks became a challenge. The flesh of his neck became so swollen that turning his head required moving his entire upper body, and his face grew jowls that hung down and created deep creases where sweat and food particles would collect. The weight gain was not just about appearance or even mobility, it was systematically destroying his body's ability to function, compressing his internal organs and straining his heart and making every breath an effort that left him wheezing and gasping even when he was sitting still. As Louis's weight increased and his mobility decreased, the basic functions of daily life that most people perform without thinking became elaborate productions that required multiple servants and often ended in humiliation for everyone involved. Getting out of bed in the morning required at least 4 strong men who would position themselves around the royal bed and coordinate their lifting to raise the king's massive body to a sitting position without injuring him or themselves in the process. The king could not roll over on his own, could not sit up without assistance, could not swing his legs off the bed and stand, so every transition from lying down to sitting up was a team effort that took several minutes of careful maneuvering. The servants would count to 3 and then lift together, trying to shift his weight without putting too much pressure on any single point of his inflamed body, and Louis would groan and sometimes cry out when the movement aggravated his painful joints or pulled at the infected sores hidden under his nightclothes. Once vertical, he needed support to remain standing because his swollen legs could barely hold his weight, and a short journey from bed to chair required servants on both sides holding his arms and essentially carrying him while his feet dragged across the floor. His breathing would become labored from even this minimal exertion, and sweat would pour from his face and soak into his nightshirt, adding to the general dampness and smell that surrounded him constantly. Sitting down was equally complicated because he lacked the muscle control to lower himself gradually, so the servants had to time their assistance perfectly to prevent him from simply collapsing into the chair with force that might break the furniture or injure his already damaged body. They would lower him slowly while he gripped the armrests and whimpered from the pain in his legs, and once he was seated it would take several minutes for his breathing to return to something approaching normal. The most humiliating aspect of this physical helplessness was what happened with his basic bodily functions, because Louis could not reach his own genitals to urinate properly and could not position himself over a chamber pot without extensive help that often did not arrive in time. The combination of his enormous belly hanging down and his inability to bend forward meant that directing his urine stream was impossible without assistance, and even with help the process was unreliable and frequently resulted in accidents. This meant he regularly pissed himself, sometimes during audiences with ministers or meetings with foreign diplomats, the urine soaking through his clothing and pooling in the chair beneath him while he tried to maintain the dignity expected of a monarch. The warm wetness would spread across his thighs and seep into the fabric of the chair, and he would have to sit there feeling it cool and become clammy against his skin until the meeting ended and servants could come to clean him. His servants would have to undress him afterward, stripping away the urine-soaked garments that clung to his massive body, and wiping down the folds of flesh where the liquid had collected and mixed with sweat to create a paste that smelled sour and rotten. They would work as quickly as possible, breathing through their mouths to avoid the stench, while Louis sat passively accepting this intimate violation of his person because he had no choice and no way to prevent it from happening again the next day. The frequency of these accidents meant that Louis was often sitting in clothing that was damp with old urine that had not fully dried, and the smell clung to him constantly, permeating the fabric of his garments and the upholstery of any chair he used. He also became prone to getting stuck in furniture that was not designed to accommodate someone of his size, wedging himself into chairs or onto toilets and then being unable to extract himself without help. These episodes would require several servants pulling and pushing while Louis shouted in pain from his inflamed joints being jostled, and the whole process was made worse by the smell emanating from his unwashed body and urine-soaked clothing, leaving the servants gagging and trying not to vomit while they worked to free their trapped monarch. The progression of Louis's physical decline included a particularly disturbing development that made everything else worse, which was that he essentially stopped bathing as his obesity made the process too difficult and painful to endure regularly. At first the gaps between washing were just a few days, which was not unusual for the era when daily bathing was not standard even among the wealthy, but those gaps stretched to a week, then 2 weeks, then a month, and eventually Louis would go for months without his body receiving any proper cleaning beyond the minimal wiping that servants could manage while he remained clothed. The reasons for this were partly physical, because moving his massive body into and out of a bathtub was an ordeal that required extensive planning and multiple strong servants and often resulted in injuries to the swollen legs that would take weeks to heal, and partly psychological, because Louis seemed to have given up on maintaining any standard of personal hygiene once his body had become so unmanageable. The logistics of bathing someone who weighed 300 pounds and could not stand unassisted were genuinely daunting, requiring a specially reinforced tub and at least 6 servants to lift him in and out, and the whole process would take hours and leave everyone involved exhausted. Getting him out of the tub was particularly dangerous because his wet skin was slippery and the servants had to maintain their grip while lifting dead weight that could easily pull them down if anyone lost their footing. After several incidents where servants were injured during these bathing attempts, including one man who threw out his back permanently, the staff became increasingly reluctant to undertake the process, and Louis himself grew to dread the pain and indignity of being hauled around like a piece of furniture. The consequences of not bathing for months at a time when you weigh 300 pounds and sweat constantly and regularly urinate on yourself were exactly as horrifying as you would imagine. His skin began to break down, developing cracks and lesions where the folds of fat pressed together and trapped moisture and bacteria. These wounds would become infected, oozing pus that added to the general wetness and smell of his body, and because they were hidden under his clothing and in the deep creases of his flesh, they often went unnoticed until they had progressed to a serious stage. The constant dampness from sweat and urine created perfect conditions for fungal infections that spread across his skin and added their own distinctive odor to the mix. The smell coming from his unwashed body intensified week by week, starting as the normal odor of someone who needed a bath and evolving into something much more disturbing, a combination of old sweat, dried urine, infected wounds, and the general smell of flesh that was rotting while the person was still alive. It was a thick, heavy smell that seemed to physically push against you when you entered a room where the king had been sitting, and it clung to fabric and hair and made people feel nauseous hours after they had left his presence. Foreign ambassadors who had audiences with Louis during this period wrote in their diplomatic correspondence about the physical challenge of being in the same room with him, describing how they had to hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces and how the smell was so overpowering it made their eyes water and their stomachs turn. Some of these reports mention that members of their delegations had actually fainted during meetings, overcome by the combination of the enclosed space, the summer heat, and the overwhelming stench of the unwashed king sitting just a few feet away from them. The Spanish ambassador wrote that negotiating with Louis was like trying to conduct business while standing next to an open sewer, and the Austrian representative reported that his translator had vomited in the corridor immediately after leaving an audience with the French king. French courtiers learned to position themselves as far from the king as the room allowed during audiences, crowding against the walls and avoiding any position that might require them to stand close to him for extended periods. They would make excuses about needing to hear better or see better, anything to explain why they were keeping maximum distance from their monarch, and everyone understood what was really happening even though no one could say it out loud. The servants who had to dress him and clean up after his accidents of incontinence were the most affected, breathing through their mouths and trying not to gag while they handled his soiled clothing and wiped at his body with damp cloths that did nothing to address the fundamental problem of months of accumulated filth ground into his skin and trapped in the folds of his massive body. The combination of extreme obesity, constant pain from gout and infected sores, and the physical reality of a body that no longer functioned properly created situations that were both darkly comic and deeply tragic, where the King of France would find himself literally trapped by his own flesh and furniture that normal-sized people used without difficulty. The throne itself became a problem because Louis would lower himself into it with the help of his servants and then discover hours later when it was time to stand that he could not extract himself from the seat without assistance. His massive thighs and buttocks would wedge into the chair in ways that made it impossible for him to generate the leverage needed to stand, and he would have to wait while servants were summoned to pull him out, gripping his arms and shoulders and hauling upward while he cried out in pain from his inflamed joints being stressed by the pulling. The wood of the throne would creak ominously during these extraction attempts, and there was always the fear that the chair would break apart completely and send the king crashing to the floor, an event that would likely result in serious injuries to his already fragile body. The servants would brace their feet and lean back, pulling with all their strength while Louis's face turned red and sweat poured from his forehead, and sometimes they would have to try multiple times before they finally freed him from the chair's grip. Even worse were the incidents when he became stuck on the toilet, sitting down to relieve himself only to find that his body had essentially formed a seal with the seat that he could not break on his own. The toilet in the royal chambers was an elaborate piece of furniture with a padded seat and carved decorations, but it had been designed for a normal-sized person and Louis's bulk overwhelmed its capacity. His flesh would spread over the seat and hang down into the bowl, and when he tried to stand he would discover that he was essentially vacuum-sealed to the furniture. These episodes required multiple servants entering the small space and working together to lift him, and the whole process was complicated by the smell of his unwashed body mixed with the smell of his bowel movements and the confined space that concentrated everything into an almost visible cloud of stench. The servants would have to position themselves carefully in the cramped room, some pulling from the front and others pushing from behind, trying to break the seal between his flesh and the toilet seat. The servants would brace themselves and grip whatever parts of the king they could reach, pulling upward while trying not to slip on the floor that was often wet with spilled urine or sweat, and Louis would scream and curse as the movement aggravated his painful legs and pulled at the infected sores hidden in his body's folds. His skin would make a wet sucking sound as it separated from the toilet seat, and sometimes there would be blood where the pressure and pulling had torn some of his more delicate skin. Sometimes it would take 15 or 20 minutes of sustained effort to free him, with servants rotating in and out because they could not stand the smell for more than a few minutes at a time without needing to step outside for fresh air, and by the end of the process everyone involved would be exhausted and traumatized. The servants who had to perform this duty would sometimes vomit afterward, not from squeamishness but from the genuine physical assault of being in that enclosed space with that smell for that long. The indignity of these situations was not lost on Louis himself, who would sometimes cry afterward from the humiliation of being a grown man and a king who could not perform basic functions without an audience of servants pulling and pushing at his body while trying not to vomit from the smell. His swollen legs were particular problems during these episodes because the gout made them exquisitely sensitive to touch, so any pressure or bumping would send sharp pains shooting through his body, and the servants had to work carefully while also working quickly because the longer the process took the more likely someone was to actually be sick from the stench. The fact that the King of France was regularly getting stuck in furniture and requiring teams of gagging servants to extract him became something that was whispered about in Paris, with people making dark jokes about how the monarchy was literally too fat to function and how the king was trapped not just by his throne but by the body that made him unable to rule effectively or even to move through his palace without constant assistance. Market vendors would make comments about the king being stuck again when customers complained about government inefficiency, and political satirists incorporated the image of Louis wedged into various pieces of furniture into their underground pamphlets that circulated despite official censorship. By the final years of his reign in the mid-1820s, Louis had essentially become a living corpse, a mass of infected flesh that smelled like death and required constant management from servants who drew straws to avoid being assigned to his personal care. His legs were so swollen and damaged that he could no longer walk at all, spending his days being carried from bed to chair and back again, and the infected sores that covered his lower body had progressed to the point where they were visible through his clothing as dark stains where pus and fluid had soaked through the fabric. The swelling in his legs had become so severe that the skin was stretched tight and shiny, and in some places it had split open under the pressure, creating wounds that wept constantly and added yet another component to the smell that surrounded him. His feet had swollen to the point where no shoes would fit them, and they remained wrapped in bandages that were changed daily and that would be soaked with discharge by the time they were removed. The smell had reached a level where people entering his chambers would immediately gag, and even his closest advisors would try to conduct business from the doorway rather than approaching close enough to speak with him directly. The air in his rooms had a physical quality to it, thick and heavy and foul, and it would cling to your clothes and hair for hours after you left, marking you as someone who had been in the king's presence. Servants who worked in his chambers developed chronic coughs and respiratory problems from breathing that air day after day, and some requested transfers to any other position even if it meant a reduction in pay. Ministers learned to deliver their reports as quickly as possible and then escape, speaking rapidly and not waiting for much response because every extra minute in that room was torture, and foreign ambassadors considered an audience with the French king to be a test of endurance that they would describe in letters home as one of the most unpleasant experiences of their diplomatic careers. The British ambassador wrote that meeting with Louis was worse than visiting hospitals during plague outbreaks, because at least plague victims had the excuse of being genuinely ill rather than having created their own physical horror through decades of gluttony and neglect. The psychological impact of seeing their monarch in this condition was devastating for France as a country, because the king was supposed to be a symbol of national strength and divine authority, but what they actually had was a 300-pound mass of rotting flesh that could not control its own bladder and that smelled like a corpse that had been left in the sun. The contrast between the theoretical majesty of the French monarchy and the physical reality of the man wearing the crown was so extreme that it undermined the entire system, because how could anyone take seriously a government headed by someone who needed help wiping his own ass and who regularly pissed himself during important meetings? In Paris, the common people who would never see the king personally still heard the stories from servants and minor officials, and the image that formed in the popular imagination was of a ruler who had literally eaten himself into immobility and who was now trapped in a body that was falling apart faster than the country he was supposed to be governing. Political cartoons showed Louis as an enormous pig wallowing in filth, and while these were officially suppressed, everyone knew they existed and everyone understood that they were not far from the truth. Some of the more daring caricatures showed him stuck in a toilet with servants trying to pull him out, or showed him leaving puddles of urine wherever he sat, and these images spread through Paris despite the censor's best efforts. The servants who cared for him developed a kind of gallows humor as a coping mechanism, making jokes about whose turn it was to fish the king out of the toilet or to scrape the royal arse, but underneath the humor was genuine trauma from having to maintain intimate physical contact with someone whose body had become a horror show of infected wounds and accumulated filth. Some servants requested transfers to any other position in the palace regardless of pay, willing to accept lower status and reduced wages if it meant not having to spend their days dealing with the king's body. Those who remained in his service had to be compensated with extra pay for what was officially called hazardous duty, though everyone understood the hazard was not physical danger but psychological damage from spending their days in close contact with a human being who smelled like he was rotting alive. When Louis finally died in 1824 at age 69, the immediate reaction from many people at court was relief that the nightmare was finally over, that they would no longer have to pretend that the massive, stinking, incontinent creature they had been serving was actually a legitimate monarch. The preparation of his body for burial revealed just how extensively his flesh had broken down during those final years, with the undertakers discovering wounds that had never healed in areas where the skin had essentially rotted away while he was still alive, and the smell was so bad that they had to work in shifts with perfumed cloths tied over their faces and with windows thrown open despite the winter cold. They found pressure sores that went down to the bone, infections that had spread through layers of tissue, and areas where his skin had literally liquefied from the combination of constant moisture and bacterial growth. France had been ruled for a decade by a man who could not walk, could not control his bodily functions, could not bathe himself, and who smelled so bad that people fainted in his presence, and the damage this did to the dignity and authority of the monarchy was something that could not be repaired by simply putting a new king on the throne, because everyone had seen too clearly that the person wearing the crown was just a rotting human body that happened to have been born into the right family.